The air in Greene County, Nebraska, carried the sharp tang of frost and damp earth on that November evening in 1974. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple over the rolling fields of Hollow's End, a speck of a town where the land stretched wider than the ambitions of its people. Cornstalks, brittle and harvested, rattled in the wind like a chorus of dry bones. At the edge of the Whitaker farm, a single sodium lamp buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow over a weathered barn and a stone-ringed well that stood like a sentinel in the yard. Amos Whitaker, a wiry man of 42 with hands calloused from decades of coaxing life from the soil, was last seen by his wife, Clara, at dusk. He'd kissed her forehead, his breath smelling faintly of coffee, and said he was heading out to measure the well's depth. "Water's been low," he'd muttered, slinging a coil of rope over his shoulder. "Need to know how far down it's gone before winter sets in." Clara, stirring a pot of bean soup, had nodded absently, used to his quiet fixations. The well was old, older than the farm, older than Hollow's End itself, and Amos treated it like a living thing, something to be tended and understood. By 9 o'clock, when the soup had gone cold and Amos hadn't returned, Clara stepped onto the porch, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. The sodium lamp flickered, throwing long shadows across the yard. "Amos," she called, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the fields. The well stood silent, its stone mouth dark and unyielding. She crossed the yard, her boots crunching on frost-kissed gravel, and peered over the edge. The rope Amos had taken was there, tied to an iron ring embedded in the stone, its end disappearing into the black. She tugged it, expecting resistance, but it came up too easily, too light. When she pulled the last of it into the lamplight, her breath caught. The end was frayed, not cut cleanly as if by a knife, but torn, as though something had chewed through it from below. Clara's scream woke the neighbors. By midnight, the Whitaker farm was alive with flashlight beams and the low murmur of worried voices. The sheriff, Tom Hargrove, a broad-shouldered man with a face carved by years of squinting into the sun, arrived with 2 deputies. They lowered a lantern into the well, its weak glow revealing nothing but damp stone walls that seemed to drink the light. They called Amos's name, their voices echoing back, unanswered. The rope, now coiled on the ground like a dead snake, was the only clue. Hargrove knelt, running his fingers over the frayed end. "Looks like it was cut," he said, though his tone carried doubt. "But not with any blade I know. The police tried everything that night. They dropped stones, listening for the splash that never came. They rigged a heavier rope with a weight, lowering it until the spool ran out at 100 feet, still no bottom. Like the damn thing goes to China," one deputy muttered, earning a sharp look from Hargrove. By dawn, they'd found no sign of Amos, no footprints leading away, no blood, no tools abandoned in the yard. Just the rope, its end a mystery that gnawed at everyone who saw it. Hollow's End was a town of barely 300 souls, a cluster of clapboard houses and sagging barns strung along a single road that wound through the prairie. News of Amos's disappearance spread like wildfire through dry grass. By noon the next day, the general store was abuzz with theories. Old man Pritchard, who'd farmed the land since before the war, swore the well was cursed. "Dug it in '08, my pa said. Never found water, but they kept diggin'. Said it felt wrong, like the ground didn't want to give it up." Others whispered about murder, pointing fingers at drifters or even Clara, though no one could imagine her lifting a hand against Amos. The bolder ones spoke of the old stories, tales of something living in the earth, something that didn't take kindly to being disturbed. Clara Whitaker, now alone in the farmhouse, sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee. She was 40, with auburn hair streaked with gray and eyes that carried the weight of a life spent wrestling with the land. Amos had been her anchor, the one who could read the sky for rain or coax a rusted tractor back to life. Without him, the farm felt like a body without a heart. She hadn't slept since the night before, her mind replaying the moment she'd pulled up that rope. She hadn't told the sheriff about the faint scratches she'd seen on the well's inner stones, like claw marks, too deep for any animal she knew. Across the table sat Ellie Pritchard, old man Pritchard's granddaughter, barely 20 and sharp as a tack. Ellie had grown up on the neighboring farm, learning the land's rhythms from her grandfather. She knew every inch of Hollow's End, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the way the soil changed color near the creek. She'd come to check on Clara, bringing a loaf of her grandmother's cornbread, but her real reason was the well. Ellie had always been drawn to it, sneaking out as a child to toss pebbles into its depths, listening for an echo that never came. "I'll help you figure this out, Clara," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her green eyes. "Amos didn't just vanish. There's something we're not seeing." The third figure in the room was Doc Warren, the town's veterinarian and closest thing to a doctor for 50 miles. He was 60, with a wiry frame and a face lined like old leather. Doc had known Amos since they were boys, fishing in the creek and stealing apples from the orchard. He'd been there the night before, helping the sheriff search the yard, and now he sat with a notebook, sketching the well stone ring from memory. Amos knew that well better than anyone, he said, his voice low. If something happened down there, it's not natural. Not by a long shot. The three of them, Clara, Ellie, and Doc, formed an unlikely trio, bound by their connection to Amos and their refusal to let the mystery lie. Clara's grief was a quiet storm, Ellie's curiosity a spark that wouldn't dim, and Doc's steady pragmatism a tether to reason. They agreed to start at the well, to look for anything the sheriff might have missed. As they stepped into the yard, the wind picked up, carrying the faint creak of the barn door swinging on its hinges. The sodium lamp flickered again, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. Ellie knelt by the well, her fingers tracing the iron ring where the rope had been tied. She noticed something the sheriff hadn't, a faint notch in the stone, barely visible in the daylight, as if something heavy had scraped against it. "Look at this," she said, pointing. Clara and Doc leaned in, their breaths catching as they saw it, not just a notch, but a series of them, circling the inner rim like the marks of a trapped animal. Doc's face darkened. "That's not from any tool Amos used," he said. "And it's fresh." Clara's heart pounded as she remembered the scratches she'd seen the night before. She hadn't mentioned them, afraid they'd sound like the ravings of a grieving widow. Now, seeing the notches, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "What could do that?" she whispered. Ellie shook her head, her braid swinging. "Something strong. Something that didn't want to be down there." They decided to lower a lantern again, this time with Ellie's climbing rope, stronger than the one Amos had used. Doc rigged it to a pulley he'd brought from his truck, and they worked together, lowering the light into the darkness. The well seemed to swallow it, the glow fading long before it should have. They pulled the rope back up, expecting to find the lantern intact. Instead, the rope came up empty, the knot at the end undone, as if something had slipped it free. The three stood frozen, staring at the rope. The wind howled, and from somewhere deep in the well came a sound, a low, guttural scrape, like stone grinding against stone. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to send Ellie stumbling back, her eyes wide. Clara gripped the well's edge, her knuckles white. Doc's voice was barely a whisper. That wasn't the wind. As the sun dipped lower, painting the fields in shades of blood and gold, a figure appeared at the edge of the yard, a stranger, tall and gaunt, wearing a coat too heavy for the season. He stood motionless, watching them, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Clara's breath caught. No one came to Hollow's End unannounced. Not in 1974. Not ever. The stranger's silhouette lingered at the edge of the Whitaker farm, framed against the dying light of the November sky. His coat, heavy and dark, seemed to absorb the last rays of the sun, and the wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow. Clara Whitaker, Ellie Pritchard, and Doc Warren stood by the well, the rope still in their hands, the echo of that guttural scrape from the depths still ringing in their ears. The air in Hollow's End, Nebraska, was thick with frost and suspicion, the cornfields whispering secrets as the wind swept through. Clara's voice broke the silence, sharp and unsteady. "Who's that?" She stepped forward, shielding her eyes against the glare of the sodium lamp flickering to life above the barn. The stranger didn't move, didn't speak, just watched them with an intensity that made Ellie's skin prickle. Doc, ever the pragmatist, set the rope down and squared his shoulders. "Let's find out," he said, his tone calm but his hand resting on the pocketknife clipped to his belt. As they approached, the stranger raised a hand, not in greeting, but as if to hold them at a distance. "Heard about Amos," he said, his voice low, with a gravelly edge that suggested years of dust and whiskey. "Thought I'd come see for myself." Up close, he was older than he'd seemed, maybe 50, with deep lines etched around his eyes and a faint scar running from his left temple to his jaw. His coat was patched at the elbows, and his boots were caked with mud that didn't match the dry, frostbitten soil of the Whitaker farm. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, her grief sharpening into defiance. She'd lived in Hollow's End her whole life, knew every face, every name. This man was no neighbor. "Name's Elias Kane," he said, tipping his hat slightly, though his eyes never left hers. "Used to work the rail lines through here, years back. Knew Amos when we were young. Heard about the well, too." His gaze flicked to the stone ring behind them, and for a moment, something like fear crossed his face, though it was gone as quickly as it came. Ellie, standing a step behind Clara, narrowed her eyes. She'd grown up on her grandfather's stories of the rail workers who'd passed through in the 50s, men who'd left behind more trouble than they'd taken with them. "You're a long way from the tracks," she said. "What brings you back now?" Elias's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Curiosity," he said. "And a debt." He didn't elaborate, and the weight of his words hung in the air, heavy as the frost settling over the fields. Doc, sensing the tension, stepped in. "You know anything about that well? Anything that might explain what happened to Amos?" His voice was steady, but his fingers tightened around the notebook in his hand, where he'd sketched the strange notches they'd found on the well's rim. Elias hesitated, then shook his head. "Not much. Just that it's deeper than it ought to be. Always was." He glanced at the well again, and this time, the unease in his eyes lingered. "You folks planning to go down there?" Clara's heart lurched. The idea of descending into the well hadn't crossed her mind, not yet. But the thought of Amos, trapped or worse, made her stomach twist. "If that's what it takes to find him," she said, her voice quieter now, almost lost in the wind. Elias nodded, as if he'd expected as much. "Be careful what you dig for," he said, then turned and walked back toward the road, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't look back. The three stood in silence, watching him disappear into the dusk. Ellie broke the spell, her voice sharp with determination. "We need to know what's down there. Amos didn't just vanish, and that rope didn't cut itself." She glanced at Doc, who nodded, though his face was grim. "Let's start with what we've got," Doc said. "Those marks on the well, the rope, that sound. We'll need better equipment than a lantern on a string. I've got some climbing gear in my shed, ropes, harnesses, maybe a better light. But we need to be smart about this. That well's old, and it's not talking." They agreed to reconvene at dawn, when the light would be better and the chill less biting. Clara insisted on staying at the farm, unwilling to leave the well unguarded. Ellie and Doc reluctantly left her, promising to return with supplies. As they drove away, the sodium lamp flickered again, casting jagged shadows across the yard. Clara stood alone by the well, her breath fogging in the cold, listening for that scrape again. It didn't come, but the silence felt heavier, as if the well was holding its breath. By morning, the Whitaker farm was bustling again, though the mood was grim. Ellie arrived with her grandfather's old climbing gear, sturdy ropes, carabiners, and a heavy-duty flashlight she'd borrowed from the feed store. Doc brought a portable winch, rigged to a tripod he'd cobbled together from spare parts. The townsfolk had started to gather, drawn by the mystery and the whispers of the well's dark history. Old Man Pritchard was there, leaning on his cane, muttering about the curse. "Told Amos to leave it be," he said, loud enough for Clara to hear. "That well's been trouble since my pa's time." Clara ignored him, focusing on the task at hand. She helped Ellie and Doc set up the winch, the metal creaking as they secured it over the well's mouth. Ellie, who'd climbed the bluffs near the creek as a teenager, volunteered to go down first. "I'm lighter," she said, buckling a harness around her waist. "And I know how to handle a rope." Clara wanted to argue, but the fire in Ellie's eyes stopped her. The girl was young, but she had the stubbornness of someone who'd grown up wrestling the land. Doc handed Ellie the flashlight, its beam cutting through the morning mist. "Stay on the line," he said. "3 tugs if you need us to pull you up fast." Ellie nodded, her braid swinging as she stepped onto the well's rim. Clara tied the rope to the harness, her hands trembling but steady enough to knot it tight. The crowd watched in silence, their faces a mix of fear and fascination. Ellie descended slowly, the rope feeding through the winch as Doc turned the crank. The well's walls were slick with moss, the air growing colder and damper the deeper she went. The flashlight's beam caught glints of quartz in the stone, but no sign of Amos, no tools, no scraps of clothing. At 30 feet, she called up, her voice echoing strangely. "It's tight down here. Walls are closing in." At 50 feet, her voice was fainter, tinged with unease. "Something's carved into the stone. Notches, like up top, but deeper." Clara's heart pounded. "What do they look like?" she shouted down. "Like claw marks," Ellie called back. "But too big for any animal. And there's something else, a ledge, maybe 10 feet below me. I'm going to check it out." Doc tightened his grip on the winch, his knuckles white. "Be careful, Ellie," he said, though his voice was too low for her to hear. The crowd pressed closer, their whispers growing louder. Old Man Pritchard muttered something about the thing that waits, but Clara shot him a look that silenced him. Ellie's rope went slack for a moment, then taut again. "I'm on the ledge," she called, her voice muffled. "It's wider than I thought. Oh, God." Her words cut off, replaced by a sharp gasp. The rope jerked violently, and the winch groaned as if something heavy had pulled against it. "Ellie!" Clara screamed, lunging for the rope. Doc cranked the winch, his arms straining, but the rope wouldn't budge. The crowd surged forward, shouting, as Clara grabbed the flashlight from Doc's bag and shone it down the well. The beam caught nothing but stone and shadow, no sign of Ellie. Then, from the depths, came another sound, not the scrape this time, but a low, rhythmic thud, like footsteps climbing up the walls. The rope twitched again, and something glinted in the flashlight's beam, a metal object, small and shiny, tumbling up from the darkness. It landed at Clara's feet with a soft clink, a pocketknife, its blade engraved with Amos's initials. The pocketknife lay in the frostbitten dirt at Clara Whitaker's feet, its engraved initials glinting under the weak November sun. Amos's knife, there was no mistaking it. Clara's breath hitched, her fingers trembling as she picked it up, the metal cold and heavier than it should have felt. The rhythmic thud from the well had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against the gathered crowd. Ellie Pritchard's rope hung taut, unmoving, as if whatever held it below had frozen in place. The air in Hollow's End, Nebraska, carried a chill that sank into the bones, and the cornfields surrounding the Whitaker farm seemed to lean inward, watching. Doc Warren, his face pale beneath his weathered tan, gripped the winch with both hands, his eyes locked on the well's dark mouth. "Ellie, answer me," he shouted, his voice cracking. No response came, only the faint creak of the rope against the pulley. The crowd, neighbors, farmers, and a few curious souls from town, murmured nervously, their earlier fascination giving way to dread. Old man Pritchard, leaning on his cane, muttered something about the well's curse, but Clara's glare silenced him again. She clutched the knife, her mind racing. Amos's knife, here, now, but no Amos. And Ellie, where was Ellie? "We're pulling her up," Clara said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. She dropped the knife into her coat pocket and grabbed the winch handle, helping Doc turn it. The rope resisted at first, as if something below was fighting to keep it, but then it gave, inch by agonizing inch. The crowd held its breath, the only sounds the groan of the winch and the distant caw of a crow circling the barn. When Ellie's head finally broke the surface, her face was ashen, her green eyes wide with something beyond fear. Her braid was tangled with cobwebs, and her hands, still gripping the flashlight, shook violently. Doc and Clara hauled her over the rim, and she collapsed onto the ground, gasping. The crowd surged forward, but Doc waved them back, kneeling beside her. "What happened, Ellie? What did you see?" Ellie's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "There's something down there. On the ledge. It's not natural." She coughed, her breath fogging in the cold air. "I saw markings. Not just notches. Symbols, carved deep, like they were old. And there was a smell, like rust and something sour. Then the rope jerked, and I heard footsteps." Clara's heart thudded. "Footsteps?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ellie nodded, her eyes flicking to the well. "Heavy ones. Coming up. I thought," she trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know what I thought. But I dropped the flashlight, and then Amos's knife was just there, on the ledge, like it was waiting for me." Doc's jaw tightened. He glanced at the well, then at the crowd, some of whom were already whispering about ghosts or worse. "We need to clear these folks out," he said to Clara. "This isn't a show." Clara nodded, her grief and fear hardening into resolve. She turned to the crowd, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Go home. We'll handle this. Please." Her tone left no room for argument, and slowly, reluctantly, the townsfolk dispersed, casting wary glances at the well as they went. Once they were alone, Clara, Ellie, and Doc sat in the farmhouse kitchen, the pocketknife on the table between them. Ellie, wrapped in a quilt, sipped coffee, her color slowly returning. She described the ledge in more detail, a narrow shelf of stone, about 50 feet down, wide enough for a person to stand on. The symbols she'd seen were unlike anything she knew, sharp, angular lines that seemed to twist when she looked at them too long. They weren't random, she said. They felt deliberate. Like they meant something. Doc, flipping through his notebook, paused at his sketch of the well's rim. "These notches up top," he said, tapping the page. "They match what you saw down there? Same size, same depth?" Ellie nodded. "Bigger, maybe. But the same kind of mark. Like something clawed its way up, or down." Clara's fingers traced the knife's engraving, A.W., Amos Whitaker. "He never went anywhere without this," she said softly. "If it was down there, he was down there. But why? And how did it come back up?" Her eyes met Ellie's, then Doc's, searching for answers neither could give. Doc leaned back, his chair creaking. We need to know more about that well. Not just the stories, facts. Who dug it, when, why it's so damn deep. Amos was no fool. If he was measuring it, he had a reason. He glanced at Ellie. Your granddad knows more than he's saying. He's been muttering about that well since I was a kid. Ellie frowned. He won't talk about it. Says it's bad luck. But I can try. She hesitated, then added, there's something else. When I was on the ledge, I felt, watched. Like something was just out of sight, waiting for me to move. Clara's stomach twisted. She hadn't told them about the stranger, Elias Kane, or the way he'd looked at the well, like he knew its secrets. She opened her mouth to speak, but a knock at the door stopped her. It was Sheriff Hargrove, his face grim under his hat. Clara, we found something, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Out by the creek, near the old mill road. Thought you should know. He held up a plastic bag, and inside was a torn piece of fabric, denim, stained with dirt and something darker, like dried blood. Clara's breath caught. It was from Amos's jacket, the one he'd been wearing the night he vanished. Where exactly, she asked, her voice tight. Caught in some brambles by the creek, Hargrove said. No tracks, no other signs. But it's his, isn't it? Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The creek was a mile from the well, across fields, and through a copse of cottonwoods. How had Amos's jacket ended up there? Hargrove's eyes flicked to the pocketknife on the table. That Amos's too, he asked. Clara nodded again, and he frowned. We're searching the creek now, but it's slow going. The ground's frozen, and the water's murky. If he's out there, he didn't finish, but the weight of his words hung heavy. After Hargrove left, promising to return with any news, Clara, Ellie, and Doc sat in silence. The denim scrap felt like a false lead, a distraction from the well, but it raised new questions. Had Amos made it to the creek? Had someone taken him there? Or was the jacket planted to throw them off? Ellie, her curiosity reignited, suggested checking the creek themselves. There might be something the sheriff missed, she said. Something only someone who knows this land would see. They set out at dusk, the sky a deep indigo streaked with clouds like spilled ink. The creek was a sluggish ribbon of water, bordered by brambles and cottonwoods that creaked in the wind. Ellie, with her farmer's eye, scanned the ground, noticing subtle disturbances, a broken twig, a patch of flattened grass. Someone's been here, she said, pointing to a faint boot print in the mud, half hidden by leaves. It was too large to be Amos's, and the tread was unfamiliar, not the work boots common in Hollow's End. Doc knelt beside the print, his face grim. Could be a hunter, a drifter. Or our friend Elias. He glanced at Clara, who hadn't mentioned the stranger to him or Ellie yet. She took a breath, ready to tell them, but Ellie interrupted, her flashlight catching something in the brambles, a glint of metal, half buried in the mud. She dug it out with her fingers, a rusted survey pin, the kind used to mark property lines, stamped with a date, 1908, the year old man Pritchard said the well was dug. What's this doing here? Ellie asked, turning the pin over in her hand. It was heavy, its edges worn but sharp, as if it had been driven into the ground and then uprooted. Clara's mind raced back to Elias's words, a debt. Had he been here, at the creek, years ago? Or was this another piece of the well's buried history? As they stood by the creek, the wind carried a new sound, not the scrape from the well, but a low, mournful howl, like an animal caught in a trap. It came from the direction of the Whitaker farm, where the well waited, its stone mouth silent but not empty. Ellie's hand tightened around the survey pin, and Clara felt the weight of Amos's knife in her pocket. Something was calling them back, the mournful howl lingered in the air, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, pulling Clara Whitaker, Ellie Pritchard, and Doc Warren back toward the Whitaker farm. The rusted survey pin, stamped with 1908, weighed heavy in Ellie's hand as they trudged through the frost-crusted fields, the Nebraska dusk settling over Hollow's End like a shroud. The well loomed ahead, its stone ring catching the last glimmers of twilight, and the sodium lamp above the barn flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced across the yard. Clara's fingers brushed the pocketknife in her coat, Amos's initials, A.W., etched into her memory as much as the blade. The howl had come from this direction, she was sure of it, and it wasn't the wind or any coyote she'd ever heard. Ellie broke the silence as they approached the well. That pin, she said, holding it up to the dim light. It's from when they dug this thing. My granddad said they marked the land back then, set boundaries before the well went in. But why's it out by the creek, a mile away? Her green eyes flicked to Clara, then Doc, searching for answers neither had. Doc, his face lined with fatigue, adjusted his glasses and studied the pin. Could be someone moved it. Or it got dug up when the creek shifted course years back. But it's no coincidence, not with Amos's knife showing up. He glanced at the well, his voice dropping. We need to go back down. Ellie, you said there was a ledge with symbols. We need to see them, photograph them if we can. Something's not right here. Clara's stomach twisted. The thought of sending Ellie, or anyone, back into the well made her skin crawl, especially after the rope had jerked and the footsteps had echoed from below. But the knife, the pin, the torn denim from Amos's jacket, they were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to the well's depths. I'll go with her, Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. Amos is my husband. If he's down there, I need to know. Ellie shook her head, her braid swinging. You're not trained for climbing, Clara. I am. Let me handle it, but we'll rig a second rope for you to follow if you want. Doc can work the winch. Her tone was firm, but her eyes held a flicker of fear, remembering the ledge and the feeling of being watched. They set to work under the sodium lamp's flickering glow, the barn's creaking door a constant rhythm in the background. Doc reinforced the tripod winch, adding a second rope for Clara, while Ellie checked her harness and clipped a Polaroid camera to her belt, borrowed from the general store's dusty shelves. The crowd from earlier had dispersed, but Old Man Pritchard lingered at the edge of the yard, his cane tapping the ground like a metronome. You're stirring up trouble, he called, his voice thin but sharp. That well don't give up its secrets easy. Clara ignored him, focusing on the rope in her hands. She wasn't a climber like Ellie, but she'd hauled hay bales and wrestled calves her whole life. She could handle this. As Ellie descended first, the rope feeding smoothly through the winch, Clara watched the well's mouth, half expecting that guttural scrape to return. It didn't, but the silence felt heavier, like the air before a storm. Ellie's voice echoed up from 50 feet down. I'm on the ledge again. It's stable. Clara, come down when you're ready. Her flashlight beam flickered, catching the same quartz glints Ellie had described before. Clara clipped into her harness, her heart pounding as Doc cranked the winch. The well's walls closed in as she descended, the air growing damp and cold, smelling of moss and something sharper, like rusted iron. The stone was slick under her fingers, and those claw-like notches Ellie had mentioned were everywhere, some fresh, some so worn they blended into the rock. When Clara reached the ledge, Ellie grabbed her arm, steadying her. The shelf was wider than Clara had expected, maybe 6 feet across, but it felt precarious, the darkness below swallowing the flashlight's beam. Ellie pointed to the symbols carved into the wall, sharp, angular lines that seemed to twist and writhe in the light. They weren't random scratches, they formed a pattern, a series of shapes that looked almost like letters, but in no language Clara recognized. Ellie snapped a Polaroid, the flash blinding in the confined space, and the photo developed slowly, revealing the symbols in stark clarity. Look at this, Ellie whispered, pointing to a section of the wall. Among the symbols was a name, carved deeper than the rest, Elias Kane. The letters were rough but unmistakable, and below them, a date, 1952. Clara's breath caught. Elias, the stranger who'd appeared the night before, had been here, 22 years ago. A debt, he'd said. What had he left behind in this well? Amos never mentioned an Elias, Clara said, her voice echoing off the stone. But that knife, it was on this ledge. And now this. She touched the carved name, her fingers trembling. The rock was cold, but the air around it felt warmer, as if the stone itself held a pulse. Ellie's flashlight swept the ledge, revealing more, a pile of small stones, arranged in a deliberate circle, like a marker or a shrine. In the center was a rusted tin, the kind used for tobacco or small tools. Ellie opened it, her hand steady despite the tension in her face. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, with faded ink. She unfolded it carefully, and Clara leaned in, reading over her shoulder. It was a map, hand-drawn, showing the Whitaker farm and the creek, with a line connecting the well to a spot marked with an X near the old mill road, the same place where Amos's jacket had been found. At the bottom of the map was a single sentence, written in a shaky hand, "The dead is in the earth." The words sent a chill through Clara, colder than the well's damp air. Elias, she whispered. He knows something. He was here, back then. Maybe he's the reason Amos is gone. Before Ellie could respond, the rope above them twitched, not the gentle tug of Doc's winch, but a sharp jerk, as if something had grabbed it from above. The flashlight beam swung wildly as Ellie grabbed the wall for balance. "Doc," she shouted, but no answer came. The rope jerked again, harder, and a low, grinding scrape echoed from below, not above. It was the same sound they'd heard before, but closer now, rising from the darkness beneath the ledge. Clara's heart raced. She grabbed Ellie's arm, pulling her toward the ropes. "We're going up. Now." But as they clipped into their harnesses, the winch above groaned, then stopped. The ropes went slack, and for a moment, the only sound was their breathing and the scrape from below, growing louder, closer. Ellie's flashlight caught something in system, something, a glint of metal, a shadow moving in the dark. Clara's pulse hammered as she gripped the rope, her eyes locked on Ellie's. "What's down there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the scraping sound, which now seemed to pulse with intent, like a heartbeat in the stone. The flashlight beam flickered, catching the edge of something below the ledge, not a person, not an animal, but a shape, indistinct and fleeting, like a trick of the light. Ellie yanked the rope 3 times, the signal for Doc to pull them up, but the winch didn't move. The scrape grew louder, closer, and Clara's hand tightened on Amos's knife in her pocket. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was coming. The scraping sound from below the ledge grew louder, a relentless grind that echoed through the well's stone throat, clawing at Clara Whitaker's nerves. The air in the confined space was thick with damp and the sour, metallic scent Ellie had described, a smell that clung to the back of the throat like a warning. Clara's fingers tightened around Amos's pocketknife, its engraved initials pressing into her palm, while Ellie Pritchard fumbled with the flashlight, its beam jittering across the well's walls. The ropes hung slack, the winch above silent, and the shadow below, whatever it was, moved closer, its form still indistinct, a flicker of motion that defied the light. "Ellie, climb!" Clara hissed, shoving the younger woman toward the rope. Ellie, her face pale but resolute, clipped her harness tighter and started pulling herself up, hand over hand, her boots scraping against the slick stone. Clara followed, her arms burning with the effort, her heart pounding as the scraping sound became a rhythm, almost a chant, rising from the darkness. The Polaroid of the carved symbols, Elias Kane's name, the date 1952, the cryptic map, was tucked into Ellie's jacket, a fragile clue to the mystery that had swallowed Amos. Halfway up, the rope jerked violently, nearly throwing Clara back to the ledge. Ellie gasped, her flashlight slipping from her hand. It fell, spinning, its beam slicing through the dark before it shattered against the stone below. The well plunged into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the sodium lamp filtering down from above. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural hum, a sound that wasn't human, wasn't animal, but something older, heavier, like the earth itself groaning under a weight it couldn't bear. "Doc!" Ellie shouted, her voice echoing. No answer came, only the creak of the barn door far above, carried on the wind. Clara's arms ached, but she kept climbing, her breath ragged, driven by the thought of Amos, his knife, his jacket, his absence. The well's wall seemed to close in, the claw-like notches under her fingers feeling alive, as if they pulsed with the same rhythm as the hum below. They reached the rim, gasping, and tumbled onto the frost-crusted ground. The Whitaker farm was silent, the sodium lamp flickering erratically, casting the yard in a strobe of yellow and shadow. Doc Warren was gone, the winch unmanned, its crank still. Clara's eyes darted to the barn, the fields, the road beyond, but there was no sign of him. Only Old Man Pritchard remained, standing at the edge of the yard, his cane planted in the dirt, his face unreadable. "Where's Doc?" Clara demanded, scrambling to her feet. Pritchard's eyes, clouded with age, flicked to the well, then back to her. "Told you," he said, his voice low and bitter. "That well takes what it wants." Ellie, still catching her breath, pulled the Polaroid from her jacket and thrust it at Pritchard. "What do you know about this?" she asked, pointing to the carved name, Elias Kane, 1952. "You were here back then. What happened? What's down there?" Pritchard's hand trembled on his cane, and for the first time, Clara saw fear in his weathered face. "Elias," he muttered. "Should have known he'd come back. Should have known it wasn't done." He turned away, hobbling toward the road, but Clara grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. "Tell us," she said, her voice a blade. "Amos is gone. Doc's missing now. Whatever you're hiding, it ends tonight." Pritchard sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across gravel. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But not here. Not by that damn well." He led them to the farmhouse, where the kitchen table still held Amos's knife and the rusted survey pin from the creek. Clara lit a lantern, its warm glow a stark contrast to the cold dread settling over them. Pritchard sat heavily, his hands folded around his cane. "In '52, he began, Elias Kane was a rail worker, passing through with a crew fixing the tracks. Young, cocky, thought he knew everything. He and Amos, your Amos, Clara, were friends, thick as thieves. They used to sneak out to the well, daring each other to climb down, to see how deep it went. Boys being boys, you know. But the well, it wasn't just a hole in the ground. My pa said it was dug wrong, too deep, like they'd tapped into something they shouldn't have. He paused, his eyes distant. One night, Elias went down alone. Said he'd prove it was nothing, just a dry well. Amos was there, watching the rope. Something happened, nobody knows what. Elias came up screaming, covered in scratches, babbling about a shadow that moved. He left town the next day, never came back. Not till now. Clara's heart sank. And Amos? What did he say? Pritchard shook his head. Amos wouldn't talk about it. Changed him, though. He got quiet, started spending more time at the well, measuring it, like he was trying to understand it. I thought he'd let it go, but, he trailed off, his eyes flicking to the Polaroid. Those symbols. I saw them once, when I was a boy. Pa said they were older than the farm, older than Hollow's End. Said they marked something that was meant to stay buried. Ellie leaned forward, her voice sharp. What's down there, Pritchard? What took Amos? And where's Doc? Before Pritchard could answer, a sharp crack echoed from the yard, like wood splintering. Clara leapt to her feet, rushing to the window. The barn door hung open, one hinge broken, swinging wildly in the wind. The sodium lamp flickered out, plunging the yard into darkness, but in the moonlight, Clara saw a figure, tall, gaunt, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Elias Kane. He's back, Clara whispered, her hand closing around Amos's knife. Ellie and Pritchard joined her at the window, their breaths fogging the glass. Elias stood by the well, motionless, his head tilted as if listening to something below. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, another survey pin, identical to the one from the creek, glinting in the moonlight. Clara's mind raced. The map from the tin, the line from the well to the creek, the dead in the earth, it all pointed to Elias. Had he lured Amos into the well? Had he come back to finish something started in 1952? And Doc, had he gone looking for Elias and paid the price? We need to confront him, Ellie said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He knows what's down there. He's part of this. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. But as they stepped toward the door, the ground trembled, a low, rumbling vibration that shook the farmhouse, rattling the lantern and sending Amos's knife skittering across the table. From the well came that guttural hum again, louder, angrier, and this time, it was joined by a new sound, a voice, faint and distorted, calling Clara's name. She froze, her blood turning to ice. It was Amos's voice, unmistakable, rising from the well's depths. But it wasn't pleading or desperate, it was calm, commanding, as if he were standing right beside her. Clara, it said again, echoing through the night. Come down. Ellie grabbed her arm, her eyes wide. Don't listen, she whispered. It's not him. It can't be. But Clara's hand was already on the door, the knife in her pocket a burning weight. Elias stood by the well, his silhouette unmoving, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through the earth, pulling her toward the darkness, the voice calling Clara's name from the well cut through the November night, sharp and clear, yet impossibly wrong. It was Amos's voice, but it carried a weight that wasn't human, as if the well itself had borrowed his tone to lure her closer. The ground beneath the Whitaker farm trembled, a low rumble that shook the frost from the grass and sent a shiver through the old barn's timbers. Clara Whitaker stood at the farmhouse door, Amos's pocketknife heavy in her pocket, her heart torn between grief and dread. Ellie Pritchard gripped her arm, her green eyes fierce with warning, while old man Pritchard leaned on his cane, muttering about debts and curses. Outside, Elias Kane stood by the well, his gaunt silhouette framed by moonlight, the survey pin in his hand glinting like a promise, or a threat. Clara, don't, Ellie said, her voice low but urgent. That's not Amos. You heard what Pritchard said. Something's down there, something old. It's using him. Her braid was still tangled from the well, her hand smudged with the well's damp moss. The Polaroid of the carved symbols, Elias's name, 1952, the cryptic map, lay on the kitchen table beside the rusted survey pin from the creek, pieces of a puzzle that now felt like a trap. Clara's eyes locked on Elias. He hadn't moved, his head still tilted as if listening to the well's hum, now a pulsing rhythm that vibrated through her boots. He knows, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Elias was there in 52. He's part of this. I'm not losing Amos, or Doc, without answers. She pulled free of Ellie's grip and stepped into the yard, the cold air biting her face. The sodium lamp flickered back to life, casting jagged shadows across the well's stone ring. Ellie followed, grabbing a flashlight from the table, while Pritchard hobbled behind, his warnings ignored. As they approached, Elias turned, his scarred face half hidden by his hat. "You heard it, didn't you?" he said, his gravelly voice calm but heavy. "It's calling you, Clara. Same way it called Amos. Same way it called me, all those years ago." "What's down there?" Clara demanded, her hand closing around the knife. "What did you do to my husband?" Elias's lips twitched, not a smile but something sadder. "I didn't do nothing to Amos. He went looking, same as I did. The well, it don't let go easy." He held up the survey pin, its rusted surface catching the light. "This marked the land in '08, when they dug too deep. They found something they buried again. But it remembers. It waits." Ellie stepped forward, her flashlight trained on Elias. "You carved your name down there in '52. You and Amos. What happened? What's the debt?" Elias's eyes darkened, and for a moment, he looked older than his years, worn thin by secrets. "We were kids, stupid and brave. Thought the well was just a story. Went down with a rope, found the ledge, saw the symbols. Then we heard it, the hum, the voice. It wasn't words, not then, but it got inside us. Amos wanted to go deeper, but I ran. Left him down there, alone. When I came back up, he was different. Said he'd seen something, made a promise. I left town, swore I'd never come back. But the well don't forget a debt." Clara's chest tightened. "A promise? To what?" Elias shook his head. "To whatever's down there. It's not alive, not like we know it. It's the earth's heart, old and angry. Amos kept coming back, measuring, listening. I think he was trying to pay it, to keep it quiet. But it wanted more." The ground rumbled again, stronger now, and the hum became a roar, shaking the well's stones. Clara stumbled, catching herself on the rim. The air grew thick, the sour, metallic smell overwhelming, and from the well came Amos's voice again, louder, commanding, "Clara, come down. Pay the debt." Ellie grabbed her, pulling her back. "We need to find document. He's out here somewhere. We can't go down there blind." But Clara's eyes were fixed on the well, her heart torn. If Amos was down there, alive or not, she couldn't leave him. And Doc, where was Doc? A shout broke the tension. From the barn, Doc Warren staggered into the light, his face bloodied, his glasses cracked. "Clara," he called, limping toward them. "It's not what you think." He clutched his notebook, its pages torn, and pointed to the well. "I went looking for Elias, found something else, tracks, leading to the barn. Someone's been hiding there." Before Clara could process this, the ground shook violently, and the well stones cracked, a jagged split running through the rim. The hum became a scream, and the air pulsed with heat, as if the earth itself was exhaling. Elias dropped the survey pin, his face pale. "It's waking," he whispered. "We're out of time." Clara made her decision. "We're going down," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "All of us. We end this now." Ellie protested, but Clara's glare silenced her. Doc, despite his injuries, nodded, his pragmatism giving way to resolve. Elias hesitated, then picked up the survey pin, his expression grim. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, but he followed, tying a rope to his waist. They rigged the winch again, stronger this time, with all 4 ropes secured. Clara went first, her hands steady despite the fear clawing at her. Ellie followed, then Doc, with Elias last, his movement slow, as if every step was a confession. The well's walls closed in, the notches deeper now, some dripping with a dark, viscous liquid that wasn't water. The hum was deafening, vibrating through their bones, and Amos's voice echoed again, not from below but all around, as if the stone itself spoke. At the ledge, 50 feet down, they found more than symbols. The wall had split, revealing a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person. The air inside was hot, pulsing, and the smell was unbearable, rust, decay, and something alive. Clara's flashlight caught a glint, Amos's wedding ring, lying on the ledge, its band scratched but intact. She clutched it, tears burning her eyes, and stepped into the passage, the others following. The passage sloped downward, twisting into the earth, its walls carved with the same angular symbols, now glowing faintly, as if lit from within. The hum was a physical force, pushing against them, and the voice, Amos's voice, grew clearer, urging them deeper. At the end of the passage was a chamber, vast and impossible, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center stood a stone slab, etched with symbols, and on it lay Amos, or what was left of him. His body was intact, his eyes open, staring upward, but his skin was gray, his limbs stiff, as if the earth had drained him. Around him, the ground pulsed, veins of dark liquid threading through the stone, converging on the slab. Clara fell to her knees, a sob tearing from her throat. "Amos," she whispered, reaching for him, but Doc grabbed her arm. "Don't touch him," he said, his voice shaking. "Look." He pointed to the veins, which moved, writhing like living things, connecting Amos to the chamber's heart. Elias stepped forward, his face ashen. "This is the debt," he said. "It takes one to keep it quiet. Amos paid it, like I was supposed to." Ellie's flashlight swept the chamber, revealing bones, human, animal, scattered across the floor, some ancient, some fresh. "It's a sacrifice," she whispered. "The well, it's alive. It's been taking people for years." The ground shook again, and the veins pulsed faster, the hum rising to a scream. Amos's body twitched, his eyes locking on Clara's. "Pay it," he said, his voice not his own, and the chamber shuddered, stones falling from the walls. Clara stood, her grief hardening into defiance. "No more," she said, pulling Amos's knife from her pocket. She drove it into the slab, cracking the stone, and the veins recoiled, the hum faltering. Ellie grabbed a rock, smashing the symbols, while Doc and Elias tore at the veins, ripping them from the earth. The chamber roared, a sound of rage and pain, and the ground buckled, throwing them to their knees. They scrambled back through the passage, the well collapsing behind them, stones tumbling into the depths. They climbed the ropes, lungs burning, as the hum faded and the earth stilled. When they reached the surface, the well's rim was shattered, its mouth sealed with rubble. The sodium lamp flickered out for good, and the night was silent, the air clean for the first time in days. Clara clutched Amos's ring, her tears falling onto the frost. Doc, bloodied but alive, put a hand on her shoulder. Ellie stood by the well's ruins, the Polaroid crumpled in her hand. Elias, his debt paid or broken, walked into the fields without a word, his silhouette swallowed by the dark. They buried Amos's body the next day, in a quiet corner of the farm, under a cottonwood tree. The well was gone, its secrets buried, but Clara felt its weight still, a reminder of the cost of holding on. She looked at Ellie and Doc, their faces etched with the same resolve, and knew they'd carry it too. Hollow's End would heal, but it would never forget. The lesson was clear: some debts are paid not by giving in, but by fighting back, by refusing to let the past consume the present. As Clara stood by Amos's grave, the wind soft through the corn, she felt a quiet strength, hers, Amos's, the town's. The well was silent, but its echo lingered, a question unanswered: what else lay buried in the earth, waiting for its time?